And we're here, obviously, today because this is the day of Durban 3. But, you know, let's see what else is going on. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is going to speak to the General Assembly today. Abbas speaks tomorrow. This underlines a very important point. This is not, you know, a bad week for the United Nations. This is not an aberration that can be corrected. This is not a momentary flaw in the long march to the sunlit uplands of the UN's future. This is the way the UN is every day. You just don't read about it. You don't hear about it in the media. But the pervasiveness of anti-Israel feeling, anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and anti-Americanism is there as an undercurrent all the time. So as you evaluate the environment that we find ourselves in, don't be shocked about what's happening. This is the way it is all the time, number one. Number two, the Durban 3 declaration, which will be adopted, as Ann said, later today, is part of a concerted effort that's been unfolding for some time with several objectives, the central objective of which is the delegitimization of the State of Israel. There are these currents, as I've said, of anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. There are complaints about particular policies and actions of one Israeli government after another, criticisms of the United States when it supports or defends the actions of an Israeli government. But fundamentally what's going on here is delegitimization. People will try to divert our attention from that. They will try and say that the Durban 3 and related activities really are concentrating on the larger global question of racism. The argument is made that we've misinterpreted Durban 1, that we focused on the NGO conference and some of the unfortunate things that a few radical groups and individuals said, and that actually Durban 1's governmental declaration really wasn't that bad. In fact, Mary Robinson, another former High Commissioner for Human Rights, has said repeatedly that on the Middle East, Durban 1's actually a pretty good statement. I remember actually what the U.S. view of Durban was as it unfolded day by day, because I sat in Secretary of State Powell's morning staff meetings. Now, I wasn't dealing with UN affairs or human rights then. I was doing proliferation and arms control. But as a veteran from the Bush 41 administration, I talked to Secretary Powell about this regularly. And I know that it was his strong feeling, his urgent wish, that the Durban Conference really would address the problems of international racism and that it would make a constructive contribution to the global debate on that subject. He was in constant touch with the U.S. government delegation in Durban. He was on the phone to his counterparts in, I can't even begin to count how many other countries, to try and urge a successful negotiation of the final declaration. And it was ultimately his decision, which of course he discussed with President Bush, to pull the U.S. delegation out of Durban because of the text of the declaration itself. Now, you can argue that he should have pulled us out before Durban started. You can argue he should have pulled us out after the first day rather than when we finally did pull out. He made every intellectually honest effort to see Durban through to a success. But he knew and acted on the fundamentally correct perception that the declaration was a disgrace. And he said correctly when he announced the withdrawal of the U.S. delegation that the declaration was a throwback to the days of Zionism as racism, the General Assembly's 1975 resolution. So I want to be very clear, for those who say that Durban 1 wasn't so bad and it was all this extraneous activity, and that we're really missing the point when we condemn Durban 2 or Durban 3, that is an argument that Colin Powell didn't know what he was doing when he made the decision to withdraw the United States. Now, if somebody wants to make that argument, they're free to do it. But I suggest anybody who's objective should give Secretary Powell a call and ask him what was on his mind. This process has been fundamentally flawed from even before we withdrew, and it hasn't gotten any better with age. And it's part of a long history of this effort at delegitimization. Many people will say, but isn't there anything we can do about this? Why does this happen over and over again? Well, in part, as I said before, it's because this is the way things go at the United Nations. But it's also because when you don't take a clear and dispositive stance against this sort of activity, it incentivizes the people who engage in it to continue to do it. And when you take strong action against it, you can defeat them. You can defeat them. And I'll give you a few examples. Today, as tomorrow, as a number of speakers have commented, we're going to see this application by Palestine either to become a UN member or to have the General Assembly declare the existence of a state of Palestine. And we see ongoing efforts to stop it, which may or may not be successful in whole or in part. But one could easily ask why there was any hesitation here in stopping this a year ago. There's no doubt that the statehood application, or the effort to get Palestine declared a state, is the flip side of the coin of the effort to delegitimize the state of Israel. These two things are very closely related. And the proof of that, among other reasons, will come from the text of the resolution. Of course, we haven't seen it yet, but it's been common speculation at the UN for 6 or 9 months that the text of the resolution will not only refer to the statehood status of Palestine, but will define its borders. So that means whatever is declared to be within the borders of the new state of Palestine is not Israel. And that is a delegitimization of the government of Israel throughout the entire territory. And that's really part of the point. As you've seen from the posters on the way in, the famous seal of the Palestine Liberation Organization bearing a map of Palestine, which looks suspiciously like the West Bank and Gaza, and everything else in between, because many people simply haven't given up with that aspiration. Now, on the statehood question, this issue, as Yogi Berra would say, is deja vu all over again. In 1988, the Palestine Liberation Organization declared the existence of the state of Palestine. Over half the UN's membership then recognized the declaration of statehood. And the PLO began a campaign throughout the UN system to obtain membership in the UN's specialized agencies, obviously aiming for a vote ultimately in the General Assembly here in New York. And its first target was the World Health Organization. The PLO dispatched Fatih Arafat, Yasser's brother, the PLO Minister of Health. I bet you didn't know they had a Minister of Health. And of course it was Arafat's brother, why not? And they picked the WHO very deliberately because it opens every year the season of UN specialized agency governing conferences in Geneva, and because the World Health Organization looked like an easy target. A humanitarian organization which has made many contributions to world health, it looked like the easy way to open the door. Now, at that time, I was just becoming Jim Baker's Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs. I was trying to get myself confirmed, which has never been an easy job for me. But even as I was still an assistant attorney general at the time from the Reagan administration working to stop the PLO effort. And it became very clear, it wasn't hard to figure out, that the PLO was going to succeed in this effort. It had overwhelming support from third world countries, and it had overwhelming support in Europe, too. And a number of European diplomats said to me as I tried to persuade them to vote against the PLO's membership application, they said, look, we understand, you know, you're just going through this pro forma. You've got to do it. It's domestic politics. You know, you can't take another position, but we understand. And I have to say, I was amazed by this. But there wasn't any doubt what the direction was, and I had any number of conversations with Jim Baker, who was as determined as I was to make sure this didn't happen. And in due course, we issued a short statement by Jim Baker that said he would recommend to the President that the United States cut off funding, voluntary or assessed contributions to any UN agency that enhanced the status of the PLO in any way. Now, remember, the first target here was the World Health Organization. So it was a humanitarian agency that we were threatening in some people's views. And they were outraged. They were outraged. And what happened? We stopped the PLO dead in its tracks. And it has not resurfaced for another 20 years. This isn't hard to figure out. If you want the United States to be listened to in the United Nations context, talk about money. It's amazing what a bracing attitude you can get from doing it. Had the United States been willing to do the same with this episode in the PLO's history, we wouldn't be talking about this today. If we had been willing to threaten to cut off funding for the UN Human Rights Council, for its activities in support of Durban 3, we might have had a broader impact there as well. This is the sort of thing that if you're not willing to act on behalf of your principles, others will draw the inference that you really don't care about it that much. And it is possible that having established credibility about your determination to prevent these abuses, that with credibility comes strength. And this, too, was demonstrated 20 years ago when in 1991, the Bush administration, working obviously closely with Israel and many groups representing here, succeeded in an extraordinary diplomatic campaign to repeal the 1975 Zionism is Racism resolution. Because people thought, my God, they threatened to cut off money if they had simply admitted the PLO. Who knows what these people will do if we don't repeal Zionism as racism? Now, some in the UN system say, oh, that was such undue pressure and it was so unfair. Well, thank you. That's how you get these things accomplished. So that while it's certainly not easy, it is possible to overcome this inherent bias that I spoke of. I thought in 1991, after we had repealed ZR, that things would change for Israel in the United Nations, that it would be treated as a normal nation, that by now, 20 years later, Israel would have become a member of a regional group, would have assumed its seat on the Security Council, and of course, that hasn't happened. I've been called many things in the course of my career. Naive is usually not one of them, but I was obviously naive in 1991 in thinking that things had fundamentally changed. But the battle can be won, and the individual struggles can be won if you are prepared to take the necessary steps. So as you go through the conference today, considering the evil that Durban 3 and the declaration they will adopt later today represents, and the concerted efforts to delegitimize Israel in ways large and small, please remember that discouragement is the best ally of Israel and America's opponents in the UN, and the best antidote is to keep fighting. Thank you very much.